My name is Dr. Suzanne Wertheim. I am a linguistic anthropologist. In 2011, I left UCLA and left the academic world to found my own company called Worthwhile Research and Consulting. And I decided what I needed to do was take all the knowledge that had been, maybe not all the knowledge, that had been stuck behind elite university doors and bring it out to people who could really use it in their everyday lives. And that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years and change.
What, you've worked with so many companies. Is there one thing, I mean, I know there's a lot of things, but is there one thing that you tend to see when you go into an organization? And I think of anthropologists, I think of you digging through things, right? So you're digging through conversations, I guess. Is there one thing that seems to be systemic across most organizations today?
There are a lot of things, but um, I would say there are two big things that I'd like to
Okay.
touch on. The
Okay.
first is that the idea that someone might be biased is terrifying to people, right? The idea that they might be biased or called a word that ends in ist, you're a racist, you're sexist, you're homophobic, or word that ends in phobic, is terrifying to people. But also, there is a lack of action to rectify what I think of as a data deficit that has come to people. So
Huh.
what happens is a lot of people who are at the top of companies belong to what we might call dominant groups. So white people and generally male people are the people who across the board dominate the upper levels of organizations. When you belong to a dominant group, and especially multiple dominant groups, you have had less data coming at your brain to form mental models than someone who's from a marginalized group. So for example, I'm female, I'm not Christian. Those are two things. So from the time that I was tiny, I could look at the world and see, oh, it's that way for these people, but it's not that way for me. Well, for a lot of people who are at the top and who have had a lifetime of being in a majority group and having data thrown at them, they haven't seen what it's like for people not in their own group. And so bias doesn't feel real to them. I found that I didn't quite expect this, but I have to spend a lot of time literally just demonstrating that bias is real and convincing people and showing them, here's how bias shows up, here's how bias shows up, here's how bias shows up. And only then, once it's sunk in, will they say, oh, we should devote resources to this, because people will think, well, it's not us. It's not here. We're good people. We're not biased. And I'm like, ooh, 100% of humans are biased. There's 0% chance that you're escaping.
Something came to mind as you were saying that, because I'm in that category that you talked about. And it's this, I don't know if this is right, but I've never felt othered. Is that a word?
It is hugely a word, especially in anthropology. So
I've never felt othered. And yet I was raised by, my mom was a registered nurse, shift nurse. So there was big blocks of time she wasn't there. And we were raised by a woman who was Colombian. She was very, very Black. Didn't ever think of her as, I did. She was, Julie. I never had that. So I had a little different relationship. And we went to South Central LA and played in Watts, and never, it didn't come across to me. But this point of having bias, as we have this conversation, I'm thinking I saw a list one time. It was like a circle of 75 different biases. And I looked at them and was, oh, yeah, I have several of those. And I'm not positive or negative. It just was, that's a fact of life. To your point, 100% of us have a bias.
I mean, and the thing is that I try to sort of level set anytime I come in, and I lead a lot of executive training, inclusive leadership development in particular. And so I'm very often in rooms that are almost completely white. I myself, for people who are curious, I am technically white, but I've been racially othered by white people since I was young. So I have this interesting perspective on the world. But on the census, I got to check off white. I don't have another option. We emerge from the womb set up for bias. Our brains are set up for bias because we can only process so much information at a given time. And we use shortcuts and snap judgments, right? This has helped us survive as a species. There's something evolutionary about it, but it also means that at times when we're on autopilot, the snap judgments come through, and those snap judgments are usually informed by data. As I was saying, a lot of people have a data deficit, and they haven't been able to create mental models using the full array of data out there. It's just been denied to them. So I'm like, it's not your fault that you've been denied data, but isn't now a great time to get that data and reshape your mental models? So yeah, so that's a thing that I think is important to understand that. And in particular, it's very useful with language, because language is in our brains quite differently than any other skill that we acquire.
Oh,
For example, there's nothing else that you can't be a native of after a certain age. But if you think about it, after puberty, you're never going to be a native speaker of another language anymore, because your brain has rewired. So the ways that we store and process language in our brains puts us on autopilot so much of the time that those snap judgments and those incomplete mental models come out all the time. And so we might have the best intentions, know that we're good people, try to be as fair as possible, and still something comes out through our language that shows that there's a bias in there that maybe we didn't know about or we don't want to come across.
What you've done here is you've kind of lit up my radar to, it feels to me as if collectively as a society, we have become hyper aware of language inclusivity, and it's gotten more and more and more. Someone like yourself who's been studying this your whole career, you must enjoy the fact, I'm guessing, that people are paying attention to this and they didn't before. Am I right?
Yes. From both a professional perspective, like there are more people who are interested in hiring me, but also from the perspective of my goal is harm mitigation, right? I mean, so I was doing it through education at the university. How can I train people to see the world in a way that lets them deal with it in a way that's aligned with their intentions? And so the more people are interested in hearing what I have to say, the more harm mitigation work I can do, right? So it's very exciting to me. One of the problems, which again means that I won't go out of business anytime soon, we hope, is that my fields of linguistics and linguistic anthropology have done a terrible job of communication and PR with the general public over the last few centuries. A terrible job.
Ironically. See, that's how you study language.
Yeah. So people who are younger than me in the field are now doing a great job with podcasts, going on Twitter, doing all kinds of things. But I look at, for example, the way that the general population's understanding of anatomy, for example, has changed since the Middle Ages, right? We have a much more scientific perception. The way that people have studied the body and how the body interacts with the world around it has drastically changed. I don't hear people talking about four humors anymore, for example, right? The base understandings of language, sort of these misconceptions of language that have been around for hundreds of years, haven't changed in the same way. And so a lot of what I'm doing is re-educating people as to how language works. So I agree with you that people are hyper aware. Some people are more aware of language, but because there is a not good enough understanding of how language actually works that's out there in the world, people, for example, mistake what language is for words and word meanings. So what I hear a lot is stories of, for example, a person is being harassed by her VP. A Black woman is being really treated very badly by her VP, who's a white woman. She goes to HR, but there are no words that the HR person can hear. There were no racial slurs used, right? So that person isn't equipped to understand what the harassment looks like, because she's like, well, there are no words. She didn't say A, B, C, D, E. And so that is a very small slice of what language is. And coming from linguistic anthropology, I have a whole toolkit, different ways you can slice and dice an interaction and say, oh, here's where it's coming through. If we look at it through this lens, and we can see it here. So on the one hand, I'm very excited that there's more attention. And on the other hand, I wish that my field had done a better job, so people were coming with a better toolkit to analyze language.
One of the things I hear in conversation is that there's this notion of living in a cancel culture, right? Which is when you say the wrong thing, it's almost every day in the news, someone extols a belief and it is taken wrong or it was said wrong, whatever, and they're canceled by some part of the population, which has caused a lot of people to just shut up. Like, I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to get canceled. And that is a very, very new phenomenon, like just in the last couple of years. What do you say when you're talking to leaders who have an awareness or growing an awareness? They want to do better, but they say, Suzanne, I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing.
I mean, I hear it almost every day.
Right.
And if it's not said explicitly, it's between the lines, right? I have many things. I have many things to say to you and to them. I'm going to try to be succinct. The first thing is that I don't like cancel culture, but I do like accountability.
Fair.
And so there's a way that both in my interviews when I go into the workplace and I ask people about their experiences, and in the research out there, and in what I see in the world around me, there's very often a lack of accountability for someone who does or says something harmful, something that is non-inclusive, something that's biased, something that's problematic. So on the one hand, we do see a lack of accountability. Another side of this is that on the one hand, the decentralization of media has wonderful benefits, where people whose voices weren't able to be heard now can rise to the top, but it also can lead to a mob mentality and a way that people will pile on without knowing the full story, or making an assessment that is just a label, but doesn't really have an explanation behind it. So even if the person has said something problematic, nobody's explaining to them, here's what the problem was, here's how you can fix it, here's what you should do better the next time, here's how to avoid it. So what I've done is I've created what I call the 6 principles of inclusive language. And they can be used on both sides, if you want to call it that way. I don't like to think about both sides, but there's a person who said something that may or may not be problematic, and there's a person who wants to say, hey, there's a problem with that thing you just said. Both of these people can use these principles and go through them like a checklist. And if the thing that was said violates one of those principles, it's like, oh, okay, you said something that erased people. You spoke as if only white people had been on this land, but actually had been inhabited by Native Americans for much longer than that. So that's where the slip up was. And then you know how to fix it. On the other side of things, you can also use it to defend yourself. If you don't violate any of the principles, you can say, well, here are the 6 principles of inclusive language. The thing that I said didn't violate any of them, so I don't think it's appropriate to be calling me out. So that's why I'm working to bring science, frameworks, protocols, taxonomies, checklists to this space that can feel very chaotic and very charged. And I'm like, well, there's actual science, so let's just use social science and have a conversation where someone can say, oh, hey, no, I didn't mean to say it that way. So here, let me say, and then run an apology. So a lot of people are very frightened. I will end by saying that silence is not the answer, because it leaves people who are being treated badly feeling like nobody cares. And so I see this again and again. I do post-exit interviews, or I will interview people in an employee experience interview set, and I'll say, how's it going? And I'll ask different questions. Are there ever times you feel like you're not seen? Are there times you feel like you're not valued? Have you ever been treated like you're lower than your actual position? And they'll tell me their stories. And then I'll report to the executives. I'm like, you've got a whole class of people who are ready to leave. And if you don't say anything because you're afraid, they're going to go and think you didn't care, not that you were afraid.
I love, there's t-shirt moments in these talks every week. And the t-shirt moment that I want to acknowledge right now is silence is not the answer. That was fantastic, Suzanne. I really appreciate just if our listener only takes away that part, they will have profited from this conversation.